to begin this evening's official book launch ceremony. I want to ask you to please stand as we are about to begin with a word of prayer by Dr. Minerva Glasgow.
Okay, let's bow our heads for prayer. O Lord, our God, how majestic is your name in all the earth. We give you thanks and praise for who you are. Your love never fails, and your mercies endure forever. We thank you for bringing us safely to this book launch. In a very special way, I ask a blessing upon Dr. Richard Cox, the one who will review this book in conversation with the author. Specifically, I want to bring before you our Prime Minister, the author, Dr. the Honorable Ralph E. Gonsalves. Father, I thank you that you have endowed him with strength of character and that he can stick firm to his convictions to the extent where he can write this book that we can read, share, and understand. Father, tonight, I pray that this specific book, A Time of Respair, beyond COVID, volcanic eruption, Hurricane Elsa, and global turmoil, fresh hope for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, will indeed help us to understand that irrespective of our challenges, that there is fresh hope in you. Oh Lord, I pray that those of us who read this book, that the trajectory of our thoughts will be changed, and that we'll understand that hope springs eternal in the human breast. Father, tonight, I ask that our perspective will change and that we'll understand that you are in charge of every situation that confronts us in this nation. Thank you again for your love and for your mercies. Bless each one of us and help us always to remember that whenever we are confronted with trial, that we look unto Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Into your hands, I commit everyone tonight. In your name, I pray thanksgiving. Let all of us say amen. Amen.
Please remain standing as Miss. Yes. Okay. Kindly have your seats. Thank you. Dr. the Honorable Ralph E. Gonsalves, Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Mrs. Gonsalves. Honorable Rochelle Ford, Speaker of the House of Assembly. Honorable Rennie Batiste, Speaker of the OECS Assembly. Senator the Honorable Kissel Peters, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. other members of Cabinet of St. Vincent and Grenadines, Dr. Richard Byron Cox, head of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification in Capacity Development and Innovation Office, Mr. Sion Marshall, Press Secretary to the Prime Minister, members of the Diplomatic Corps and Consular Corps, senior public servants, chairpersons and chief executive officers of statutory corporations, members of the business community, specially invited guests, representatives of the various media houses, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good evening. Let me welcome you to this momentous occasion of the official launching of the latest book written by Prime Minister Dr. Ralph E. Gonsalves, titled A Time of Respair, Beyond COVID, Volcanic Eruptions, Hurricane Elsa, and Global Turmoil, Fresh Hope for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. This evening's session will see the author of Time of Respair, Prime Minister Dr. Ralph E. Gonsalves, joined by Dr. Richard Byron Cox in a conversation-style setting to discuss the rich contents of the Prime Minister's latest book, which will delve into historical development of St. Vincent and Grenadines, the challenges and opportunities of small island developing states such as St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The book will also touch on future developments, leadership, the policies of Prime Minister Gonsalves' administration, and the backdrop and principles behind those policies. Ladies and gentlemen, this, I believe, Prime Minister, is your 10th book, thereabout. I remember, yes, in the last 12 years, there are many pamphlets and other publications. I remember in this very hall, in 2019, the previous book was on the labor movement, political economy of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But on the program, as we will follow this evening's proceedings, we will have remarks to be given by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Honorable Crystal Peters. We'll have the profile of the author and Dr. Byron Cox by Mr. Sion Marshall, Press Secretary. A special rendition by Mr. Rodney Small, Cultural Ambassador. And of course, we'll have the conversation and then a special rendition by Mr. Darren Andrews. And from there on to the extreme right, my right, to the back of the room, you'll have the book signing by the author, Prime Minister Gonsalves. And that basically will end tonight's proceedings. Without any further ado, I want to call on our first speaker to give remarks, the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, Honorable Crystal Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. the Honorable Ralph E. Gonsalves, Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Mrs. Gonsalves. The Honorable Rochelle Ford, Speaker of the House of Assembly. The Honorable René Batiste, Speaker of the OECS House of Assembly. Other members of Cabinet of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Dr. Richard Byron Cox, Head of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, the UNCCD, Capacity Development and Innovation Office. Mr. Sion Marshall, Press Secretary in the Office of the Prime Minister, members of the Diplomatic and Consular Corps, senior public servants, chairpersons and chief executive officers of statutory corporations, members of the business community, specially invited guests, representatives of media houses, ladies and gentlemen, good night. It is indeed an honor to deliver brief remarks at the launch of the book entitled A Time of Respair, Beyond COVID, Volcanic Eruptions, Hurricane Elsa, and Global Turmoil, Fresh Hope for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which was written by our esteemed Prime Minister, Dr. the Honorable Ralph E. Gonsalves. Upon receiving my copy in September 2022, I began reading this book. This book takes the reader on a journey from the historical to the contemporary, and therefore it sets the context as it relates to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And as I have said in previous occasions, in all things, context is important. As I read A Time of Respair, it highlighted the fact that reality requires a response. The response gives rise to resilience, and the resilience reignites Respair. This book is a must-have, and if you are yet to obtain your copy, I encourage you to do so tonight. The reality is that I have always encouraged my friends and loved ones that we have to face our deepest fears, especially when reality is one of them. And the reality is that St. Vincent and the Grenadines is one of the most disaster-prone countries in the OECS. During the last decade, various tropical storms, hurricanes, and unseasonal weather conditions have affected St. Vincent and the Grenadines. In larger states, a natural disaster or a climate shock can be localized to particular areas. However, in the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, any shock is a national one, impacting persons throughout the nation. As it relates to response, over the last 34 months, our realities required several responses by this administration. As the youngest cabinet member, I joined this administration in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, which had arrested many of our key sectors, quite notably that of tourism. In response, this administration implemented a number of programs to assist our citizens and our sectors. With the rising number of COVID-19 cases by the end of December 2020, this administration was required to deliberate and respond as regards the remainder of the festive Christmas season and whether further activities should be cancelled in the interest of public health. You can imagine our surprise as we sat in cabinet and we started receiving notifications from our family, from our friends, that the giant in the north, that of the Respair volcano, began sending smoke signals via an effusive eruption. Fast forward to April 2021. After months of remote learning, a decision was made to reopen schools. And then, boom, our giant in the north erupted explosively, displacing 20% of our population and destroying homes and livelihoods, and ultimately disrupted plans for the return of face-to-face learning. As we pressed on as an administration to address the COVID-19 pandemic, the volcanic eruptions, the dislocations and disruptions, Hurricane Elsa made landfall on St. Vincent and the Grenadines as the first hurricane of the 2021 Atlantic hurricane season. In her wake, she left damage to homes and infrastructure as well as livelihoods. While recovering and implementing our response to the aforementioned shocks, in February 2022, tensions between Russia and Ukraine escalated, resulting in further price increases on a range of commodities such as fuel, fertilizer, food, drinks, building materials, and transportation, scarcities of certain products, increased cost of infrastructure, rising interest rates, etc. All of these realities required a response, and the response is documented in this book, A Time of Respair. As it relates to resilience, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, my responsibility is not merely to represent St. Vincent and the Grenadines. My responsibility is to represent our people, our hopes, our fears, our vulnerabilities, and most importantly, our quest to build a modern, competitive, many-sided, post-colonial economy. In an effort to build our resilience, this administration has over the last 22 years implemented robust policies which are in keeping with our National Economic and Social Development Plan. The plan outlines the country's long and medium-term strategies for national development and offers a vision for improving the quality of life of all Vincentians. These goals are as follows: to re-engineer economic growth, enabling increased human and social development, promoting good governance and increasing the effectiveness of public administration, improving physical infrastructure, preserving the environment, and building resilience to climate change. And finally, building national pride, identity, and culture. A Time of Respair encourages us to embrace fresh hope for our beloved multi-island state, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We must not be daunted by the giant that dwells among us, the climatic forces that devastate us, neither the geopolitical tensions that severely affect us. We must always find solace in our national anthem, which reminds us that whatever the future brings, our faith will see us through. I draw our attention to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 1 to 8. It reminds us that to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. Within the last 34 months, the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines have experienced many seasons. A time to mourn. Vincentians have mourned the death of their loved ones as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. Vincentians have cleared the debris after the volcanic eruption and Hurricane Elsa and embarked on rebuilding that which was destroyed or damaged. A time of war and a time of peace. Vincentians have experienced the effects of global turmoil, and as leaders, we have placed social safety nets in place and have at every opportunity called for peace, security, and prosperity for all. In the final analysis, ladies and gentlemen, we have another season to aspire to, and that season is a time of Respair. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. I will now invite the Press Secretary, Mr. Sion Marshall, to give a profile on the author, Prime Minister Dr. Alfie Gonsalves, and his discussant, Dr. Richard Byron Cox. So he's no stranger to the podium. So welcome, Mr. Sion Marshall.
Dr. the Honorable Ralph E. Gonsalves, Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Honorable Rochelle Ford, excuse me, Speaker of the House of Assembly, the Honorable Rennie Batiste, Speaker of the OECS Assembly, Senator the Honorable Kissal Peters, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, other members of Cabinet of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Dr. Richard Byron Cox, Head of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, Capacity Development and Innovation Office, members of the Diplomatic and Consular Corps, senior public servants, chairpersons and chief executive officers of statutory corporations, members of the business community, specially invited guests, representatives of media houses, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm here to present a profile on both the discussant and the man of the hour, my Prime Minister, my boss, my mentor, Dr. Gonsalves. So I'll start with the discussant. Richard A. Byron Cox is a Vincentian. He was educated in SVG and the wider Caribbean, that is to say Barbados, Jamaica, and Guyana, and in Europe and Latin America. He is trained in law, diplomacy, foreign policy, and international relations, is multilingual, and holds a PhD in public international law. He is one of the first two Vincentians to have studied in Russia, and the only one to date to have returned with a first-class honors degree after more than 30 years of Vincentians attending universities in Moscow. Byron Cox started his career in the Ministry of Legal Affairs of SVG. He later joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he worked as an advisor to both the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Prime Minister on matters of foreign policy and international law and relations. He has been employed with the United Nations organizations for 2.5 decades, working in the fields of law, environment, and sustainable development, in which he's recognized as a top international expert. Professor Byron Cox is presently the head of the Capacity Development and Innovation Office at the Secretariat of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. There, he is responsible, inter alia, for spearheading the Capacity Development Program, coordinating the Internship Mentorship Program, and leading the Secretariat's Program on Innovations. In his present work, Professor Byron Cox has realized many firsts, including masterminding and conceptualizing design, development, and implementation of UNCCD Capacity Building Marketplace and its exclusive e-learning platform. He conceptualized and managed the world's first ever project aimed at achieving land degradation neutrality in 14 countries around the world. From the project, the UN set the targets for achieving land degradation neutrality as outlined in Goal 15 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Among his other major achievements are the establishment of a comprehensive e-learning process for the UNCCD, a lecture series that covers universities around the world, an institutionalized capacity building fair, a capacity building technology fair, an awareness-raising program of exhibitions and expositions that covers from primary schools to universities, a mentorship program, conceptualization of the Bonn UNCCD International Conference of Universities, design and development of a special internship program for young professionals from SIDS and LCDs. Professor Byron Cox has been special guest and/or distinguished lecturer at many universities around the world, including Yonsei University, South Korea, Bonn University, Oxford University and the University College of London, the Hacettepe University of Ankara, Turkey, the Kazamai University in Iran, the Addis Ababa University, the Universities of Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Havana, and the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. He is a visiting lecturer at the University of Cologne, Germany, the Centre International de Formation Européenne in France, and Wageningen University in Netherlands. Professor Byron Cox has written books and contributed chapters to others on law and environment, the latest being Globalization, Environmental Law, and the Global South, launched at the University of Cologne, Germany last November. He also writes for journals and newspapers on many subjects, including international law, international environmental law, and politics, and on Caribbean affairs. He also writes poetry and literary texts, and has published the critically acclaimed and historical novel, Where Mama Stares in Vain. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Richard Byron Cox. This bio would only give a glimpse of the individual Ralph Everett Gonsalves, but as someone who's worked with him, there's so much more that is not here, but I'll read what is here. Ralph Everett Gonsalves was born on August 8, 1946, to Alban Gonsalves and Theresa Francis of Connery, a rural village in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. He is married to Eloise Gonsalves Nee Harris and has 3 sons, Camilo, Adam, and Storm, and 2 daughters, Isis and Soleil. Dr. Gonsalves was educated in St. Vincent and the Grenadines at the Connery Roman Catholic School and at the St. Vincent Boys Grammar School. He later completed a bachelor's degree in economics at the University of the West Indies, there obtaining several noteworthy accolades, including President of the Debating Society and President of the Guild of Undergraduates. In 1971, he obtained a master's in government from the University of the West Indies. In 1974 and 1981, he obtained a PhD in government and a degree of Utter Barrister at the University of Manchester, England, and Gray's Inn, London, respectively. Dr. Gonsalves became the deputy political leader of the Unity Labour Party, the ULP, in 1994. The ULP, a merger of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Labour Party and the Movement for National Unity, a political party which at the time of the merger, Dr. Gonsalves was the leader, won the St. Vincent and the Grenadines general elections held on March 28, 2001. At the time of the elections, Dr. Gonsalves has since been elected to political leader of the ULP, and as such, he became the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines on the same date, March 20th, 2001. And for that, we are all grateful. He has remained Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines since then, winning elections again in December 2005, 2010, 2015, and 2020. Concurrently, while pursuing his political career and prior to becoming the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Dr. Gonsalves practiced law extensively and successfully before the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court in a wide range of matters, but particularly in the fields of constitutional law, administrative law, matrimonial law, real property law, law of tort generally, and law of contract. Dr. Gonsalves has researched, written, and published extensively on a range of matters touching upon the Caribbean, African, trade unionism, comparative political economy, the developmental issues generally, among others. Among his publications are History and Future, A Caribbean Perspective, 1994, The Politics of Our Caribbean Civilization, Essays and Speeches, 2001, The Making of the Comrade, The Political Journey of Ralph Gonsalves, 2010, Diary of a Prime Minister, 10 Days Among Benedictine Monks, 2010, The Case for Reparatory Justice, 2014, Our Caribbean and Global Insecurity, 2017, The Making of a National Hero, Law and Practice in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 2018, The Political Economy of the Labor Movement in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 2019, The Trial of George McIntosh and the 1935 Uprising in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 2020, The Atomized Individual, The Social Individual, and the COVID Vaccine, 2021, The Idea of Barbados, 2021, and tonight's publication, A Time of Respair, Beyond COVID, Volcanic Eruption, Hurricane Elsa, and Global Turmoil, Fresh Hope for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Ladies and gentlemen, the man of the hour, Dr. the Honorable Ralph E. Gonsalves.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Marshall. Now, Mr. Marshall listed a series of books and publications, and many of them written while he is Prime Minister. It's an amazing thing to do while governing a small island developing state with many challenges. But you see, it's very important because when you're a leader, you're not only leading for today, but you're leading for tomorrow. And ideas, as we know, are very powerful. And ideas put into books so that persons like myself and those who are watching and listening on the future of this country, that those ideas can live on and be implemented. I now invite our cultural ambassador, and his team to give us a special rendition, Mr. Rodney Small.
These songs of freedom, redemption songs, redemption songs. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can see our light. Have no fear for atomic energies, as none of them can stop the times. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Some say
Yes, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. Thank you very much, Rodney and his team. Well, I think this is the part everyone basically waiting on. I had the opportunity of reading over 280 plus pages of the time of Respair. And coming off of the rendition by Rodney Small and his team, it fits well into the book. As a matter of fact, I believe the first chapters of the book goes into some, what I call, harsh truths of our colonial history and our colonial development. But the beauty about this book, ladies and gentlemen, and those of you who are listening in your homes and watching via various social mediums, is that throughout the book, you will find parts of it looking at our economic development, the transition through the various crops grown here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the economy tied in with labor. Also, you'll find inside the time of Respair, the challenges of small island developing states such as St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and our resilience towards external influences. Also, you'll find in the book our own development post-independence. So we are talking about 1979 onwards, and the various policies by various governments and how they impact our overall economy up to present day. And of course, given what we experienced in the 21st century with the 9/11, falling of the Twin Towers, the economic crisis, and the pandemic 2020, and of course 2021, the 30+ eruptions of La Respair. And we are rising above the ashes, and surely, given the policies of PM Gonsalves' administration, which is highlighted in the book, you can see that there is hope. And that's what I believe, Prime Minister, the book basically is all about, reinvigorating that hope, that spirit of hope throughout St. Vincent and the Grenadines and our Caribbean economy. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, like I said, this I believe is the time you're waiting on, where you will witness before you the discussion to Dr. Byron Cox. In discussion and conversation with the Prime Minister, we'll basically go through chapter by chapter on the book Time of Respair, Beyond COVID, Volcanic Eruptions, Hurricane Elsa, and Global Turmoil, Fresh Hope for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So, ladies and gentlemen, I invite Dr. Byron Cox and Prime Minister to start us off in the conversation here for tonight.
Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon to all of you. I see Vincentians here from all walks of life. I'd just like to, if you permit me, we have members of the diplomatic corps here, the Spanish ambassador, the Cuban ambassador. We'd just like to recognize you as well. Dr. Gonsalves.
The Venezuelan is also here.
Oh, yes, and the Venezuelan ambassador. Excuse me. Discúlpame, por favor. Okay. Now, yes. This afternoon is a discussion with the esteemed Ralph Gonsalves. And if you allow me, I'd like to begin with something that he, the Prime Minister, will not remember. But you would understand why I want to begin there. It's not long, but you'd understand why. I was a 16-year-old boy and went to watch a football match at Annesvale. And I was coming home. In those days, you just couldn't ride because you didn't have a lot of cars in this country. And so I was standing there, squinting a ride, and this car came down with this white man. Well, in my eyes, this white man. And he stopped, you know. And he said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going into town." He said, "Well, I'm only going to French's. French's for me, town. Are you happy?" He said, "Come in." And when I got into this car, the thing was, he was a white man. I looked at the back seat, and it was full of books. It was full of books. I was 16 years old. And I said, "Excuse me, who are you?" And he said, "What?" I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "Oh, I'm a university teacher." And I said, "What do you teach?" He said, "Well, I'm a political scientist." I'd never heard that word before. It was the very first time I heard that word. And that really sort of influenced me greatly. And it's one of the reasons why I'm sitting here today. Now, why did I begin there? Ralph Gonsalves inspired me as a young boy. And today I have a PhD, thanks to that inspiration. But that's not really the reason why I'm telling you this. A whole generation has grown up only knowing one prime minister, this man. Rodney and others, we heard Rodney tonight. And could you give Rodney another round of applause? I mean, he was tremendous, right? We have doctors and so on. So many people have been inspired by Dr. Gonsalves, not just by his example as a thorough intellectual, but by his work as a political leader. So I want to begin there, Prime Minister Gonsalves, if you'll allow me. There is a reason why you write this book. Now, it's called A Time for Respair, and I know you're giving us hope. But if you look at chapter 3, for example, it's a comprehensive discussion on budget 2022. Chapters 4 and 5 is a comprehensive discussion on what is good governance, for example. Okay? The concluding chapter is powerfully written in terms of inspiration. So what is the key reason why you wrote this book?
I tell people from time to time, first of all, I'm very happy to see so many persons here come out this evening. And I want to thank Richard for agreeing to be the discussant, for all those who have made the arrangements and organization, and Rodney and Darren. And I'm really sorry that we're having it tonight when there's an event also with the central bank. If I took anybody away from the central bank, I'm sorry, and some people at the central bank would like to be here, but that's how life is sometimes. I make the point from time to time that there are 3 books of great importance. The book of life, which is written about in Revelation by John of Patmos. And I leave that largely for the theologians, but it has influence. The second is the book of history. And third is the book of ideas. And all of these relate to life, living, and production. All of them relate to human civilization, and in our particular landscape and seascape, our Caribbean civilization, which is a unique civilization. It's an island civilization, it's a seaboard civilization. The sea is very important to it. But of course, we live on the land, so that is also critical. And this history, this civilization has had a shared history. We've had a shared experience. But that experience must have an expression. Because it's one thing to have an experience, it has to have an expression. And you express things in words and in actions. And human beings in a civilization, we interact with our environment, our external, with nature, with our external political and social, economic environment. And in doing so, history, the book of history has taught us that we cannot do things without being in solidarity with one another. The idea of being an atomized individual is one which is reactionary, because human beings, certainly in our civilization and generally, but very much in our Caribbean civilization, we have achieved things by cooperating with one another and being in solidarity with one another. And the challenges which face us, the challenges arise from the legacy of underdevelopment, our history. We have challenges relating to the structural weaknesses of our economy and the organization of our society. And then there are regional and global challenges which impinge upon us. For example, the challenges relating to climate change, which are profound, in which field you deal with one particular important aspect. Question of desertification and land degradation, and drought. And we face that issue here. We have global conflicts, imperialism and hegemony, not only historically but in the current period. And I know that people find it unusual for a politician, particularly in the Western world, somebody who's in government and is prime minister, talk about imperialism. But there is imperialism. And how we address those forces. Should we roll over and play dead? That's one option. Should we accommodate ourselves? That's another option. Should we resist, and how we should resist? All those constitute part of the fabric, the matrix, the context, as Kisal points out. We, from 2001, Richard, have sought to construct a modern, competitive, many-sided post-colonial economy, which is at once local, national, regional, and global. And to do so with all the challenges which I talk about. And we have to make this paradigm shift in a relatively short period of time. Because remember this, the paradigm shift which we are engaged in and which we sought strategically to embark upon from 2001 is that we are seeking to alter a colonial and amended colonial economy which has existed from 1763. 1763 to 1969. That's 200 years. And then other leaders before me, governments before my time, have sought to make amendments. And some of those amendments have brought benefits to our people, and some of them have retarded our people. It's a complicated dialectical process. But through a convergence of circumstances, we arrived at a point where even amendments were exhausted, and we have to make this shift. For example, we have had for hundreds of years, a crop dominating our economy. And then that crop goes, another one comes. But the model, what happens is the same. It's based on a number of things, unlimited supplies of cheap, unskilled labor, subsidies at home, preferential treatment abroad, relative low level of applied science and technology, then there are no more subsidies. Modern capitalism and globalization have changed upon us, influenced us. And we have to find a new way out. And we have to be competitive. But we have to prepare ourselves for this. And for this post-colonial economy, it is based on it cannot be based other than on unlimited supplies of skilled labor, educated labor, priced at a particular level in accordance with the International Division of Labor. And we have to do this. We have to make this the shift and to put this base in place within not a model as in Cuba, which has its own history, not as in Nicaragua or Grenada under Morris Bishop. It has to be done within a competitive political system and all that that involves. Complicated process to effect these changes, and you don't have the extent of the resources. No, I've written about this because obviously before, but we arrive now with this triple whammy, quadruple whammy. COVID, the volcanic eruptions, Hurricane Elsa, the Russia-Ukraine NATO war, yes, a lot of people don't realize that there's a war taking place between Russia and NATO, but it's in the Ukraine. It's in the Ukraine. And then we have to continue this thrust, Richard, of making the alterations, and not just with the economy, but we have to build it within a cultural matrix of further ennobling our civilization, our Caribbean civilization, and to keep our society together, make it inclusive, lift the quality of life of people. And you don't have the resources, and you have to be looking for the resources. You have to build the infrastructure. You got to build the airport. You have to build the port. You have to build the Rabaca Bridge and other bridges. You have to do all the health work. You have to do the stuff in the cultural field with Rodney and Darren and so on and so forth. And how the state is interplayed with the market and the community. And these challenges are all upon you immediately against the backdrop of everything else. So, I had to write, to pull out from the backdrop, the context, the history, and the bundle of ideas, things which are relevant for us now. And why Respair? I was looking for a frame of ideas. The word Respair is a very old English word. It came into the language in the 14th century. Yeah. And by the 17th century, Respair was becoming obsolete. Means fresh hope after a period of intense dislocation, of disruption, and even among people, some people, despair. And Respair means fresh hope. I'd never understood why. I tease my English friends and tell them that the reason why the word has gone into disrepute, not disrepute, in disuse, because after the 1688 revolution, that in Britain, maybe they didn't have much for fresh hope, that they think that they had arrived at some position and they just evolve it. And that, Richard, prompted me to write this and to use the 2022 budget to show our people that out of all this body of ideas and reflections and history and all the circumstances, we have to do things real. We just can't talk about them on the radio loosely. We can't just go by the rum shop or just write something and in some flippant way. This thing requires serious thinking, and for us to be in solidarity with one another, naturally within a competitive political framework, because that's how it is. And I like it that way too. So you asked me a simple question. I had to, in order to give a summary answer, and the answer I've given is a summary one, because it's a complicated matter. And I make this final point. In the book, I quoted Karl Marx. Again, I'm probably one of the, I don't know any other leader in the Caribbean who quotes Marx. It's not because I think that Marx is infallible, far from it. But Marx said something in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon in 1859, the book he wrote. He said, men and women make history, but only to the extent that the circumstances of history permit them so to make. Part of that making of the history in the extant circumstances, and we are all involved in it, part of it is what resides in our heads from the past. And sometimes what is in our heads from the past, in fact, oft times, that weighs like a nightmare on our brains. And as we proceed in this period of extreme disruptions and dislocation, how to shed some of that baggage. And from the book of ideas, reflecting on the experiences that we have in the real world, how do we fashion a path going forward? Look, the easiest thing to do is to make facile criticisms. If you're in the cabinet of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, you would hear criticisms that I make of our government. I'm not talking about some of the simplistic things which you get where like a complaints industry, and there's a complaints industry facilitated by talk radio and Facebook and Commerce Book. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how do we solve the problems? And the important thing about Fresh Hope, it is conjoined in the literature of Paul, servant of the Lord, called to be an apostle. It connects to faith made manifest in works and love. Love for one another. And from that springs the requisite of solidarity.
Thank you very much. I will come back to Pearl and the church sooner or later. I promise you that.
Perhaps I'm the only man who quote both Marx and Paul.
But
some people may say, well, Ralph is confused to quote both Paul and Marx. It just tells you that we have to take inspiration and ideas from all the sources that we get it.
Yes. But I put it to you, Prime Minister, that before you wrote this book and before all of this happened, in other words, before COVID-19, before the volcanic eruptions, before Lisa and so on, when you came to power, your government began this process of Respair every single year. If you allow, I'd like to read from page 263 to prove the point. Please. Here you write these words. Metaphorically, in cricketing terms, the UNLP government, since 2001 and continuing, has put huge scores and mighty achievements on the tin, on the scoreboard. They are there for all to see. Our government over the last 21 years has altered life, living and production immeasurably for better for Vincentians of all walks of life, but especially so for the poor, the working people, the farmers, the fisherfolk, the children, the young people, the elderly, the women, the vulnerable, marginalized group. In the process, we have been faithful to the Constitution, the law, and good governance. We have enriched our Caribbean civilization in a myriad of ways. We have more than played our part in strengthening a mature regionalism, and we have been in international solidarity with our global family of nations in pursuit of peace, security, prosperity for all. Now, based on all of that, and based on the facts that we know, when I say the facts, for example, when you came, only about 33 of every 100 secondary school-age children went to a secondary school. We had about 27.5% indigence, desperate, dirt poor poverty. Now, to fix things like that, right, this was not just fixing a problem. It took a lot more than that. You had to give people hope, fresh hope. So I would submit to you that in truth and in fact, this book, in many ways, reflect what you have been doing for 21 years. Is that correct?
Yes. But I wanted to highlight the issue of fresh hope at this particular period because I don't think that there's any time in our history, certainly in the post-independence period, that we have had the multiple sets of challenges cascading upon us at one and the same time. And therefore, I wanted for us to lift this in a way to say, look, we have been hoping and we have been doing, we have been having the faith, we have having love, but this one requires something special. I'll tell you this, I see people, I hear people who talk. As far as I'm aware, the only country in the region, in CARICOM dealing with COVID, which did not declare a state of emergency is St. Vincent and the Grenadines. A state of emergency involves the abrogation of individual rights and freedoms. It is a particular form of repression which is used in extreme circumstances when the nation is in grave peril. But even when we considered that the nation was in great peril with COVID, we never went there because we felt that we could do things in a more measured manner within the extant constitutional framework without the suspension, essentially, of the Bill of Rights, which is what happens when you have a declared state of emergency. No. In 2000, up to March, we were doing fairly well in economic terms. Then the bottom dropped out. But because we didn't lock down, other than Guyana, which at the same time as COVID had a lot of wealth, got the newfound wealth through oil. All the other countries, including St. Vincent and Grenadines, had a decline in output. And we went 5% in the hole. But that was the smallest hole of all those who had gone into the hole. St. Lucia went 20-odd% in the hole, and the other countries, double digits, going up to that number. Then in 2021, when we were saying, well, though between September 2021 and September 2020 into January 2021, we had 97 deaths. A big number. So we had to ramp up as the circumstances admit in relation to certain measures. And then, while you're dealing with that, April, the volcanic eruptions, the IMF, everybody saying, the CDB, they say, well, you're going in the hole this year at least another 6%. But we had to pull things back. Fortunately, we did a number of things, and by the end of 2021, we had grown a half of 1 percentage point. Despite the suffer year, once we had put people back in their homes. And then in 2022, we grew by 5%. We're the only country back in the region, in CARICOM, other than Guyana, back to 2019 levels of output. And this year, we are slated to grow by 6%. No. The IMF, which is in relation to us, they always judge us very harshly because there are some ideologues in the IMF think that Ralph is running a left-wing government. And therefore, that they come to us in a jaundiced way, and things which we have to defend. Other people don't have to defend them. People who follow the gospel of the Washington Consensus in everything. And they said that because in the report in November last year, that because of the government's very decisive policy responses, that's what they call them, decisive policy responses. Notice the adjective, decisive policy responses. That because of those responses, lives were saved, livelihoods were saved, and we were able to contain, to restrict the economic disruption and the economic scars. No, that is big praise indeed. But even while that is happening, I would be a complete an utter fool to think that people, sections of our people, are not suffering. Because they're in making the change and dealing with these problems, they're really enormous. And I have to say to them, you have to embrace fresh hope in solidarity, and we have to do this thing together. But this is the pathway, and this is what the 2022 budget is saying in dollar and cents terms, and that continues into 2023. But you're right, we had always been Respairing. And I want everybody here and everybody who is listening to me, because look, I have lived far more years than I have remaining left to live. Most of the persons inside of here overwhelmingly would hear about my funeral. So I don't have any dog hunting in any race other than to see the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Caribbean, and our Latin American and Caribbean civilization, and our brothers and sisters in Africa and Asia and the world live in peace and in prosperity and security for all. But in our neck of the woods, with all these challenges which we are having, and to make the paradigm shift, to shift 200 and something years in 20 something years, you will require of us being all blessed with miraculous powers, but we are not. So we have to do this thing the hard and smart way and work together. But I tell you this, I want to see anybody come up with a different framework than the one we have presented here in the book, A Time of Respair. And in the book, we discussed all the various approaches philosophically. We discussed Garvey. We discussed Arthur Lewis. So Arthur Lewis. We discussed the New World School. We discussed variants of it. We discussed approaches, theoretical approaches, grounded in Marxism. We looked at broad measures dealing within the Washington Consensus, the neoliberal approach. We look at social democratic approaches. And in our context and in our experience, we fashion a particular approach, not discarding those which we know are going to definitely hold us back, and to look for creative alternatives, and essentially to follow within the frame of the creative alternatives the building of the modern, competitive, many-sided post-colonial economy and all the other cultural and other things which go with it. And we can talk about that a little, which is vital in the process of Respairing. You know, in the book of Ecclesiastes, it says, you try something in the morning, and it may work. And you try something in the evening, and you don't know, you ain't sure which really one way work better. But you're within a particular framework. But one thing for sure, he who looks at the wind will not sow, And he who keeps his hand idle will never reap.
Good. I had said that we will come back to Paul, and you brought me back there. That's where I wanted to go. Now we get to the real hard questions. Those were easy ones, that you can hit out the boundary. Now, we go into the difficult one. This is a country that is firmly a Christian country, believes in God. A matter of fact, in our constitution at the very beginning, it says that we believe in the supremacy of God. It's founded on that. And you are always, always, always talking about your belief in the Bible and your faith. We started tonight with a prayer, okay? And so this is a religious country, a country of faith, Christianity, right? Now,
It doesn't mean also that we are both Christian and we are both hypocritical.
In writing this book, you highlight some of the challenges that one face in Respairing. And unity is necessary as a nation if we are to properly Respair. As regards the church, and I wanted to start there when I began, but I had to tell that story, how you inspired me and inspired so many people. But everything in this country begins with the church, including the Constitution. Now, at page 255, you discuss the role of the church in helping us to Respair. If you allow, I just want to read a very short section of your own words. This is what you say. Still, the central purpose of Christian teaching is the redemption of sinners. That is to say, the redeeming of all of us. Redeeming embodies hope, faith, and love. Redeeming is akin to Respairing. So, despite the confused and confusing cacophony of voices from the Christian church about the pandemic and the vaccine, there's a huge role, nay, existential mission for the church to embrace in our process of Respairing. I expect them to take a fresh guard and fulfill their essential calling, not only in private prayer, but also in their responsible public mission where it greatly matters, as far as is humanly practicable. The church and the government ought to work in tandem in the mammoth task of mobilizing the entire society to Respair beyond the extant challenges of life, living, and production in quest of sustainable development. Here, it seems to me that you're maintaining your faith and you believe, at least this is what you say, that the church must play a fundamental role, but yet, you see how this can be divisive. As you yourself have said, we are, religious and hypocritical. So could you explain for our audience here, because many people here are Christians, what you see as the church role in us Respairing?
Let me put this within a larger bundle of ideas, or as you as a political scientist would say, in a broader theoretical perspective. And I spoke about it recently in Parliament. The state, which the government is central in the state. The state cannot create families. The state cannot make families. Indeed, the family existed before the state. If you read anything about in any of the anthropological texts, or those who have a more materialist perspective, you look at the origin of the family, private property, and the state by Friedrich Engels, you will see that the family preceded the state. The state can create conditions to help the family. Make sure you have water and electricity in the homes, have law and order maintained, and so on. But the state cannot build a family. A family has to build that. And that is itself a very involved process. Secondly, the market And we have in this country what you may call the mixed economy. And the state has a significant section of the economy. The state employs 26% of the labor force in this country, which is a significant number. But the private sector employs 48% or thereabouts, and the rest are own account workers. The market cannot be relied upon for redistributive justice. That is why the state has to specifically go and help to take care of the poor, and where working people are being pressured and to have laws and interventions and so on and so forth. And the third proposition is that a society which consists of purely individualistic persons is not sustainable. And within that society, there are several important and critical institutions. I am very happy, for instance, when trade unions are formed and when trade unions do their work. Of course, a trade union is not a political party, and sometimes if a trade union leadership tries to be a political leadership, they do things which harm their workers because they may adopt postures which are antithetical to their own members' interests. The families in that society, the teachers in the educational system, the community groups, the NGOs, and very much the church. Let us look at the church. They have an important role to play, and I agree with you. We are a Christian people. We believe in Christian religious doctrine. Once upon a time, the Anglican Church had 70-odd% of the population of this country, the allegiance of them. The last census in 2012, the Anglican Church was 14% of the population. Methodists declined, they're about 8-9%. The Catholics, my church, they're becoming a sect. They're about 6%, 6.5%. But I believe that's people who tell them that they are Catholics, mean they're baptized Catholic, but they don't go to church. They don't practice anything. But if you ask them, they will answer that if you go around and take a census. Because 6% of the population will mean 6.5 would probably mean about 7,000 people who are Roman Catholics. If you go Saturday night Mass and Sunday Mass through all the churches in this country, I don't think you got 1,500 in the aggregate in all of them, so I don't know where the 6.5% exists. And the Pentecostals and the evangelicals, the Pentecostals of different types, 29% of the population. Seventh-day Adventists is knocking your head up to 14%. Spiritual Baptists is about 9%. And there's a small group of non-believers. Yeah. And we have more churches now than ever before. And we all have to analyze and watch this thing very carefully. Every time you see a church open on one side of the street, a rum shop open on the other side. Science begins and ends with observation, you know. Huh? Bertrand Russell. And they are very good churchmen and women in this country. Very good and holy people. But Just like I'm subjected to critical appraisal, they also have to be subjected to critical appraisal. And I don't believe, not believe, the influence of a lot in the church is being reduced markedly, not only by the society becoming more secular over the years and all the modernization influences from Europe and North America, where we have a similar trend, but the church has to examine itself critically as to whether they are playing the role which they're supposed to play. And if we are all going to work together in solidarity, they themselves must reappraise themselves. I don't know how they're going to do it because I'm not a member of the clergy. But I could tell you this. Many churches are becoming places of entertainment. I will go to a church and I will hear the person who is leading the church service, not necessarily the pastor. They're telling us to make some noise. Well, I hear Skinny Fabulous and Marshall Montano tell me that when I go to a fete.
And you know you still go to fete.
And they will tell me, and some will then, after they say make some noise, they add almost as an afterthought, for the Lord. No, I am all in favor of us being very happy and celebratory in worshiping our God. I'm all in favor of that. But there is certainly a margin between entertainment and celebration in solemnity. It's just the same way like some funeral services. They're encouraged to be celebrate the life of the person who is dead. Absolutely, I will agree with that. But that doesn't mean you have to turn it into a bolo. So some people wouldn't like what I'm saying here. But you asked me the question. But I don't know. They would have to do their self-critical examination. And there is more politics in some churches than between Friday and Ralph. And they have to sort out that themselves. And I'm not pulling them down. I'm supporting the role the church is to play an important role, but they have to have the self-criticism inside and make their changes. So you asked me the question, and it is they have to define how they do it. This thing is as old as the hills, you know. In the City of God, written in the 4th century AD, St. Augustine, the bishop from North Africa, the Catholic Church, he made suggestions as to how you should live your life in the earthly city. Not only he had done that, Jeremiah, talking to the Hebrew people in the period of Babylonian captivity, addresses the same question. And years later, nearly 1,000 years later, St. Thomas Aquinas addresses it from a different perspective than St. Augustine. So you can have different perspectives, but the point is this. You have to have some connection between the doctrine and when you're working with people for the improvement of people's lives here and to prepare them as best as you possibly can for the afterlife. That's the way I see it.
Okay. Prime Minister, you mentioned that in some churches there's more politics than between you and Friday. That's what you said.
Don't nobody get their head boss yet.
Now, as I said, from here on in, the questions are going to become a little bit more difficult, because these are sensitive questions. Now, the issue of Respair, right? You as political leader of your party and as Prime Minister of this country, okay, you're showing a way. Now, we have agreed, at least from your last answer, that national unity is necessary if this Respair is supposed to be done properly, correctly, okay, as you would like to say, efficaciously. Now, the fact remains that in this country, we have serious political tribalism. And in my mind, I don't know if you share my view on this, in my mind, and you seem to share my view because what you wrote in this book says that, if you allow me, I'd like to read 3 very short pieces of your own words. Okay? On page 11, this is what you wrote. Unfortunately, over the period since March 11, 2020, up to the present time, political factionalism and other forms of divisiveness have racked our society, undermining the greater requisite of social solidarity. Over this period, general elections were held in November 2020. In keeping with competitive electoral contests in a multi-party liberal democracy, there was intense political campaigning after the return of the Unity Labour Party for its 5th consecutive 5-year term in government. Since March 2001, the political competition and divisiveness has not ceased or abated. That's page 11. On page 212, this is what you write or wrote. Broadly, the compromises to be made with certain domestic social forces are of different kind or extent to the compromises to be made externally. On the domestic front, the compromises relate principally to 2 groups, those who support the governing political party and those who oppose. These kinds of compromises are easier to accommodate on the ground. Now, one more. And on page 253, this is what you wrote. Frankly, the opposition NDP has abandoned any sense of responsibility and constructiveness. It traffics in anger, bile, falsehood, misrepresentation, fueled by a seemingly unquenchable thirst for power. Its emptiness of policy and program propels it inevitably to scurrilous ad hominem attacks against the leaders of government and their supporters. Here you're clearly saying, at least my interpretation of what you say, that this political divisiveness isn't helping in this process of Respair. 2 questions. How do you see we handling this? And do you have any hope that they will come to their senses?
Yes. First of all, in a competitive political system, and especially one which is fueled by the new technologies, communication technologies, that you're going to have differences in positions, differences in philosophy, differences in policies, and differences in programs. That is perfectly in order. By all means, let us have the differences, let us have them debated, let us have an intelligent discussion, and then the people will make a determination at election time as to which bundle of policies they would wish to have pursued. No. That's one thing. The other is a kind of mindlessness, a kind of opportunism, both on the right and on the left. Some of it quite infantile, wrapped up with a lot of personal bile and antagonism not in the relation to policy, sometimes ego and all the rest of it. And that creates a real difficulty. We saw it when we are moving towards constitutional reform. And we have seen it on very important questions. Now, this matter is not a new one. As you know, I quoted in the book from the Federalist Papers of Madison, one of the founding fathers in the United States of America, the USA, from the Federalist Papers. He addressed the issue of factionalism, and it was nasty. If you read George Washington in his farewell address, the first president of the United States, that also is a real, he identified that as a real problem for the young republic. All I can urge that we do on an ongoing basis, and certainly from our side, and I'm asking for civil society, the intellectual class, let us see if we can agree on a basic set of facts, and let us then have what opinions we want to have. That was the plea also of John Adams, the second president in the United States of America. But equally, as we know, as I make reference to Madison's complaints and George Washington's, and even before that, we had this. In my recent speech in Parliament, I went to the book of Numbers, where Korah and his supporters challenged Moses and Aaron. Could you imagine that? Then the council, what we call the parliament, they challenged Moses and Aaron. And in challenging Moses and Aaron, they wrapped themselves in the flag of God. They say, look, Moses, you think yourself to be above this community, that is what, and this is the community of God. They were speaking for God, And then they said to Moses, look, you brought us here in this desert from the land of Egypt, where the place was flowing with milk and honey, but they were in slavery in the land of Egypt. They forget that. Men wrapped up in power, with a quest for power, going at Moses and going at Aaron. And in the going at it, not only they wrap themselves in the community of God, they also accuse Moses of corruption. That is a staple. It's a long time this thing happened, and Moses had to say, listen, what are you talking about? Look at me. I have as much as take a donkey. But Moses, in the book of Numbers, had the advantage that God could devise the test and prove who is on his side and who not on his side. Well, none of us here have that now. So we have to hold a discussion intelligently and let the electorate decide. But in the process of doing what we're doing, we also have to learn in government, everybody, the art of compromise without being compromising of what you stand for, which is one of the reasons why I was holding that discussion about the compromises. It's easier from my experience, to make compromises with domestic forces, whether they're opposition or otherwise, than the compromises with imperialism or those in quest of hegemony. And to do that one, you also have to build alliances to help to protect yourself outside. That's why we're going to Argentina in Kisal and I with our team and the Community of States of Latin America and the Caribbean, because we have to be part of uniting the Latin American and Caribbean civilization in dealing with hegemony and dealing with imperialism. And we have to put forward our own agenda, whether a portion of the Bridgetown Initiative, which Mia has put forward, or the climate change agenda, the financing for development agenda, and so on and so forth. Okay. And this is why I speak to the matter of being very complicated. That's why I say when I gave you the answer first, that was, as the Rastafari brethren would say, I gave you the King James version. There's the Maccabees version which you can get. but this issue of compromises, and the compromises are vital in the parliamentary process. And to make the change from a colonial or amended colonial economy to a post-colonial one, and you're doing so through parliamentary means, it's extremely, requires extreme creativity and knowledge as to how law can be an instrument of change. And you know that there's a competitive political system, and I'm giving you the whole range of considerations when you're making the change and when you're embarking on the change. Of course, it's easy for anybody to go into office and go with the flow, Oh, okay. Easy to just go with the flow, and you just let the system run itself, and you're there, and you do the usual thing. You're prime minister. You ain't bothering with too many of the serious issues which we are talking about here. And if things happen, they happen. If they don't happen, you ain't care whether Monday fall upon Saturday, and so on and so forth. Well, that is not what people elect us for. But remember this, what we are seeking to do is no less than carrying out a transformation. What has existed in relation to what has existed in terms of the nature of the economy for 200 and something years. And it's only 22 years already. But people are seeing enough of the change to say, well, we are on the right path. That's why they give us 5 terms. They ain't dotish. That's why they give 5 terms. Even though there are all kind of reasons why you will have a substantial number of people still not against. But you can't treat them, they're not the enemy. They're our people, and we have to work with them. And sometimes you have to go over the heads of their leaders to talk to the people. Well, in fact, you always have to do that. Talk to the people themselves and let them understand what is happening. You take, for instance, the education revolution. I mean, that thing is absolutely so critical to what we are doing, and it's self-evident. But there's one aspect, and I'm sure you will come to it. In the book I discussed, which is related to what you're talking about, there is, it seems to me, a space, a fluid space in our people's consciousness, where resides the genius of the people. How to tap that genius of the people in this process of change requires enormous skill. And more than skill, approaches which resonate with them. And in that fluid space, there is also memories of backwardness and expressions of backwardness, which you have to confront with and help to alter as you seek to get in that fluid space the benefits of what I call the genius of the people.
Yes. There is a question here that I think needs to be answered. I don't think we want to answer that tonight. But I personally, I'm not talking about the general public, myself. I was old enough when you came to power to know what went before. And there's always the fear in my mind that an entire generation grew up knowing only you. And a lot of what they see here, the high school, the university scholarships and so on and so forth, the housing revolution, they would take it for granted. And I am fearful. I'm serious. I'm deadly serious here. I'm fearful that we can have an election where you lose, where this party loses, and turn back the clock. They would,
if we were to lose at any time, a backward government could turn back the clock on some things, but some others are so deeply ingrained, it is going to be very difficult. They will require a sustained period, which I don't think the people will stand for. Soboto quoted Che Guevara the other day in his speech in the parliament, where Che said, and I want to make this point, Soboto is a born-again Christian. If the Americans, well, I wish to say the Americans, if a neoliberal or an apologist for imperialism here, Soboto quotes Che Guevara, you'd wonder if he's a
Marxist.
Or he wants to lead a guerrilla war. But it gives you the way in which we develop our ideas. And he quoted Che Guevara and said that a revolutionary process is underway. Mm-hmm. When the extraordinary becomes and is accepted as ordinary. Mm-hmm. No. A lot of people don't know this. We have over 1,000 persons inside of St. Vincent, not outside, doing university degrees. In St. Vincent, between the community college and the open campus. And we have more than that number overseas.
Overseas, yes, I know.
No, this is something extraordinary. Before we arrived in office, you could have counted the number of people on your hands and your toes at university.
Yes.
It is now, everybody accepts. You had at the community college, with all the divisions of the community college, you had 500 and something students, 600 max. You now have 2,500. In September, you're going to have close to 2,700. It's an amazing thing. And the offerings. And when people think that we have finished, we are just ramping up more and more. And this year, we are spending $42 million on post-secondary and tertiary education. We are spending more on tertiary education, post-secondary and tertiary education, than we are spending on the police force. The police force is getting 41 million. I'm not talking Coast Guard and fire, just the police. And that is more than twice the number of police than existed in 2001. By the way, we have more than 5 times the global average of police per 1,000 persons. So we don't have a problem of money for the police force or the problem of numbers of policemen and women. We don't have that problem. There are other kinds of problems. But that's for another discussion at a different time. We are 42 million also there for hospital services. That's Milton Cato Memorial, Modern Medical in Georgetown, the Georgetown Smart Hospital, Levi Latham in Mesopotamia, and Chateaubriand Hospital. I'm not dealing with the $12.5 million for pharmaceuticals. I'm dealing just the hospital services to run them. It's 42 million. Imagine you getting for post-secondary and tertiary education, $42 million. It's a mind-blowing number. When a student gets a university, when he gets a national scholarship, and of course, there used to be 4, there are now 20-something. And overall, 73 in any 1 year, John. Remember, we used to have to go back. You had to go back to see if you could get 1 every 2 years. Remember those days? And then it grew a little bit to 4. No. When you see we give somebody a national scholarship, that is $570,000. I want that number to be in your head, because that is the number for the most expensive program at University of West Indies, the 5-year program in medicine at Cave Hill. Okay. And that person will get $570,000 up to that to get their education. So they'll do their first degree, they'll do their master's, whatever they want, the national scholarship. And then they come back, they have a job in the state administration. As soon as they get appointed, they can go to the bank because of the policy of the government and get an economically disadvantaged student loan, a 100% mortgage. They would have had to wait in the old days, prior to us, until the 45, 50, before they could save the 20% to go and pay the deposit. But where the challenge comes, so that person gets $570,000. They get $300,000. They have to pay it back, but they get the house for $300,000. But the scholarship helped them get the job so they could get that. So that's an investment of $870,000. Call it $900,000. And he or she is only 25 years old. They have their house. They go into the last half kilometer. There's a pothole. They also bought a car. I think in the language is a skettel, they call them, this cheap thing, for $30,000. And they're complaining about the spring. They're complaining about the shocks. Of course, if you buy a 12-year-old car, you'll complain about the shocks and the spring. It's not only the pothole humbug in that. It's why you buy. But the point is this. That is the issue which is exciting them. That Soboto didn't fix the pothole going in the last kilometer. And then they're judging Soboto, his performance as an MP. on the basis as to whether he fill the pothole or doesn't fill the pothole, forgetting that he has $900,000 worth of investment. Because the consciousness is not there that we have chosen to fill the pothole in his head than the one in the road as a more important priority. So this is the sort of honest conversation. Of course, we have to fix the pothole. That's why I went and borrowed $120 million EC from the Taiwanese, and we have to build the capacity and so forth. And we have to understand something. I discussed this in the cabinet. And I want persons to get a view, and it emerges from the book. Not in the way I'm going to tell it, but the idea emerges. Human beings overwhelmingly are permanently in a state of dissatisfaction. That is not a novel proposition coming from a politician. They may say, well, what is Ralph saying there? But it doesn't mean that because somebody, from a political standpoint, it doesn't mean that somebody is dissatisfied, in a state of permanent dissatisfaction, that you must think that they are ungrateful. Because that young man or young woman at 25 must never be accused of being ungrateful because they complain about the pothole and don't bother about, don't take into account the scholarship or the house. No, that'd be wrong. What has to happen? That person must have the consciousness that they have had needs and wants which have been satisfied, but there are others to be satisfied, and that they have made a tremendous advance in terms of their needs and their wants. And there is hope, given what is existing and the path on which you are, of having others being satisfied. Now, this discussion is one between St. Augustine in the City of God in the 4th century AD and Niccolo Machiavelli in The Prince in the 1400s, about 1,000 years after St. Augustine. Both of them share that same perspective about human beings being in a state overwhelmingly of permanent dissatisfaction. St. Augustine addresses it this way. He says, well, since you're going to be dissatisfied, what we have to do is to prepare you for the heavenly city. But you just don't leave the earthly city. You have to live your life here. So while you live in your life, this is how we want you to live your life. For instance, he suggests political quietism for the Christian and points at which you interact. Machiavelli, the same view, says to the prince whom he was advising, and that prince didn't have to face elections, said, look, because your subjects are dissatisfied permanently, there are two things you could do. You could either engender love or fear. Since you could never get them to love you really, completely because they're going to always be dissatisfied. Have them fear you. Well, I reject, and we must reject the Machiavellian perspective. We have to adopt the one which I suggested earlier, that to look at the process, that the fact that people are not satisfied is what helps to drive ingenuity of human beings too, and to improve society. And the technology helps. This is why education is important. You take, let me give an example. In 1891, remember I told you the importance of the book of history. In 1891, one of the big problems in London was the excessive amount of horses offal on the streets. Offal, for those persons who don't know, is horse, S.T. There was a big conference in London about a horse's offal. And the Times of London, which is the most important newspaper, the Times of London said, in commenting on this conference, that they really must find a solution to that problem. And because if you don't do that, by 1940, the whole of London will be covered with this thing. Because the more of it they put down, they can't clean the amount. Sabi. But by the early 20th century, the issue was a non-issue because human beings invented the combustion engine and we started to have motor cars and you stopped using the horses. And the Times thought that in 1940, London will be covered with this thing. But in 1940, there were fighter planes in the sky dropping bombs in Berlin. That's where the technology is. Now, where we come to this, we have a policy. There's a change in policy. The young people in the Ministry of Finance say we should have a new regime on dealing with the import duties for motor cars. Very important issue. Transportation is vital. And everybody wants to buy a car, that's fine. But we have to make sure that we regulate the thing properly. The average age of a car imported to St. Vincent and the Grenadines currently is 11 years. We have abandoned vehicles over 12 years. So people buy the cheapest vehicle. We have changed now. Because in 2008 is the new sweet spot. Because you buy a 12-year-old vehicle or 11-year-old vehicle, it'll be more expensive if you buy the 2008 from Japan. But when you clear it, the duty is going to be far less because it's a newer vehicle. That's how it's done, to deal with the environment and so forth. And I'm amazed that some people are finding it difficult because of politics to understand that simple point. But more importantly, I hear no intellectual voice. I hear no NGO, nobody saying, well, this issue which we're talking about is really a transitional one. Because in Japan, where we get most of our cars from, they have, as a matter of public policy, declared that by the year 2030, combustion engines would be in the minority. Most of their vehicles would be electrical vehicles. And the technology is improving. And what the Japanese will do is dump their old vehicles more and more with us between now and 2030, which is just 7 years away. And we're cussing on the radio about the change of a tax regime, which would help you. But, Ralph, now want poor people get a vehicle. But the 12-year-old vehicle now, the sweet spot is a 8-year-old. It's better you buy the 8-year-old. Less less repairs money, more fuel efficient, less of a problem on the environment. But in a very short period of time, we'll be phasing out. I know when I'm saying this, people saying, but Ralph is a dreamer, phasing out those with the combustion engine. But if they're not making them in Japan, and they started to do the same thing in Europe and in the United States, what are you going to do? You're going to make your own combustion vehicle engine among them? This is what I mean. And that is what some of the ideas I'm talking. I give examples practically. And we argue about some foolish things, which we're not supposed to be arguing about, because, Richard, people are so consumed to want to take something transient, to play on people's lack of understanding, to beat them on the head, to beat the government on its head, where we should all be on the same page and honestly say, this is something sensible. And may suggest ways of refining it and so on and so forth. By all means. Because we wouldn't get it perfect. Because perfection, we must make perfection the enemy of the good.
Okay.
And so that is how I answer the bundle of things wrapped up with your last query.
Now, we so far have focused internally as regards Respair among us here in St. Vincent. But you make a very strong case in the book that they are the external factors.
Oh,
and you
clearly.
mention quite a few of them. Now, if you allow, one of these is reparations. And I read two very short quotes. The first is on page 23. This is what you say. The Respair in 2022 and beyond cannot be completed without reparations for all these legacies of underdevelopment. Britain extractive colonialism in its own interests in St. Vincent and the Grenadines was merciless, draconian, cruel, and executed with urgency, right? That's page 23. This is what you say on page 33. Some work has been done on the road to reparations by CARICOM and the CRC, but there is far more work to be done. Educational, political, and diplomatic work is ongoing, but it has all yielded no reparations thus far from the British, the French, or the Dutch governments. The question is very simple. First, you state that we need reparations if this Respair is going to happen the way it should happen. But here you're saying that, look, we've been working on this for so long, and these people are not budging, right? How do we bridge that? How do we reconcile those two things?
We have not, as a region, and we have not as a government, though I have written about it, I've spoken about it, we have not carried out and put the resources towards carrying out a large mass campaign on the question. And we need to do that, and I'm hoping that we can ramp that up now, in this year. And this is a criticism which could be made across the region. Though we have seen that the advocacy work has yielded one or two concessions. We saw what the Dutch, just recently, their apology, rather than the mealy-mouthed issue of regret by Blair and so forth. We see the Anglican Church in Britain. We see the University of Glasgow with the University of the West Indies. Small things. We see now that an Irishman who is part owner of Digicel, Dennis O'Brien, has set up a group. Well, he doesn't use the word reparation. He's saying the quest to repair, which is what reparation is about. He's trying to see if he could market that differently. And a number of things coming around. And we need to do that, we need to ramp up all the diplomatic work, and work is being done. And we push in all our resolutions, whether at the UN, in CELAC, in ALBA, you see the issue of reparations. So it's kept alive. And we talk about it in CARICOM, we put it in official documents, and all that is good and necessary and desirable. But we need to do more, much more than we have been doing. And maybe the time is coming where we probably might have to ask for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on this particular matter. When we won the Security Council, we raised it from the standpoint of the absence of reparations and the legacy of native genocide and the enslavement of African bodies, those things constitute contemporary drivers of insecurity. So the educational work, the continued political work, the diplomatic work, and maybe now some international legal work. And sometimes what you have to do, not everybody is moving at the same pace. So on that, there is both progress and at the same time, not sufficient of it.
Okay. We're getting close to 9:30, and I think that's when you want to wrap up. But before we do so, there are a few things which I think are important. And one of them, as I said, we focused mainly on internal, and now I want to turn to the external questions. Sure. And there are many external factors which can affect our Respairing, and one of them is the role of quote-unquote imperialists. This is what you write on page 57. Imperialism's interrogation and their absurd queries were not restricted to low-level officials parading themselves with a make-believe self-importance. On 2 occasions, on my return from official visits to Libya and Iran, American delegations, officials from the State Department and American Embassy in Barbados came to St. Vincent and the Grenadines to cross-examine me on the role of Libya, Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela on the airport construction and allied political issues. Each time I spoke truthfully, in a respectful, principled, and dignified manner to their queries, comments, declaration, and vile threats. Those are your words. It tells me that it is clear to you that you will not be left in peace, to pursue an independent foreign policy, which is in the interest of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. As a matter of fact, as you know, a former prime minister of this country once asked you, what would America say if you did this or if you did that? It's something you have to face. But then again, your quest is for Respairing. So how do you fight this? How do we deal with this?
Let's deal with some factual issues as a backdrop. You remember I had said that in dealing with imperialism, neoliberalism, you can roll over and play dead. That's not an option for me. That's not an option for this government. Somebody who wants to roll over and play dead to imperialism can do that, but that's not me. If the people of St. Vincent want such a government, they can have that government. But that is not the government which I lead and will not be the government I lead. I can't roll over and play dead. So let's take that out. And they know that. Imperialism knows that. Secondly, the question of accommodating and the question of resisting. So you have to do a mixture of creative resistance and accommodation. I cannot take up St. Vincent and Grenadines and carry it to Vladivostok. It is where it is. right here near to the United States of America. It's 3.5 hours to Miami. Cuba has that problem. America looms large in the life of Cuba, and Cuba has paid a heavy price for taking a clear, unequivocal position, and still pays the price, which is a subject of continuing international condemnation of the United States' relation to Cuba. So I can't take up St. Vincent and the Grenadines and carry it to Vladivostok. The United States of America is also our main source of tourists. We do a lot of trade with the United States of America. We have a lot of technology from the United States of America. There are a lot of influences from the United States of America. After all, it's the most powerful country in the world, historically, ever. The militarily, economically, the US dollar is the reserve currency. Even the Chinese, who want to have the yuan as an alternative reserve currency, the Chinese buy hundreds of billions of treasury bills of the United States. They're denominated in US dollars. So they have their rivalries, but they are joined to the hip nevertheless. And then, of course, the largest Vincentian city in the world is Brooklyn. So I take all that into account. But I also am determined, and the people of St. Vincent are determined, for our foreign policy in relation to Cuba, for example, and Venezuela and Nicaragua, not to be determined by presidential, congressional, senatorial, or gubernatorial elections in South Florida. Because if you didn't have Florida being such an important state in US presidential elections, there would not be this ridiculous, idiotic, foolish policy of the United States towards Cuba. So I tell my American friends, this is a matter on which we have to agree to disagree. Okay. And that is why we didn't go to the Summit of the Americas. And I wrote CARICOM to say why we're not going to the Summit of the Americas. I wrote the United States President the same thing to explain why we are not going. Because you can't call it the Summit of the Americas and exclude Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, which are part of the Americas. And we do it respectfully. One American official, senior official, told me recently when I went to Brazil for the inauguration of President Lula. And we discussed many things, and this issue came up. And he said to me, well, if the summit wasn't taking place in America, but it wasn't possible to send an invitation with the summit taking place in America. Well, confirming for me, that's the political question of South Florida, the importance of Florida. But I said to him, I said, okay, if politically you couldn't do it, you should have told the persons who are telling you that you can't do it because of politics. You should have responded to them and say, that this is a matter of manners. If I agree to host the gathering here, I can't then set up at my personal residence. I can't then set about and say, well, you can't come because you say something bad about me. You can't come because me and you had something. No. It's a question of manners. I've agreed to invite everybody here. I have to invite everybody. And I say, you're too great a country to have such bad manners. So and I speak with these things without any disrespect or any animosity. And I speak with no malice. And I believe that there is a reciprocal respect in this matter. And at the same time, we work with the United States of America on several things. The United States of America, for instance, recently, because we have been talking about, you know, I particularly have been talking about the number of guns which come out of the United States. It's not an accident that the 7 of the top 10 countries in the world that have the highest murder rates per 100,000 persons, whatever that metric is, you know, and the questions you can use about that metric. 7 out of 10 of them are from the Caribbean and Central America. And one of the reasons is because the guns come out of the United States so easily. They have the right to bear arms in the United States and the like. The United States has now set up a particular unit in a Caribbean country to work with IMPACTS, the Implementation Agency for Crime and Security in CARICOM, to do tracing of weapons. For instance, one of the 8 weapons which we had at we intercepted at the port over the Christmas period. We have already, through the cooperation with the U.S., identified that weapon of having committed a serious offense in a particular state in the United States. And it's not in New York, it's a faraway state. But it followed the MO. A man commits a bad crime with a gun. What he wants to do is to get it out of the jurisdiction as quickly as possible. And one of the ways is to get it in the Caribbean and Latin America. And all you need is somebody, some other vagabond, who he gives it to and he sells it and you get it to somebody else. It comes down through the chute and so on. And we do a lot of good work with the United States of America. But there's some things where they're just plain wrong. And for instance, how could I ever accept their evangelism, quote unquote, that Cuban nurses and doctors and engineers who are doing such work across the Caribbean and elsewhere, that they are trafficking in persons? Heavenly Father, how can you when you say a thing like that, you're just abusing the notion of trafficking in persons. So all those people who are enjoying themselves and doing good work in Georgetown at the Modern Medical, they say they're trafficking in persons. Could you imagine that? And sometimes they come to some conclusions because of their politics, their internal politics, which offend common sense, which offend reason. And if it offends reason and common sense, I will be completely untrue to myself and to the people whom I represent, to go along with them with that foolishness. So I will tell them plain and simple, that is foolishness. And I have interacted with leaders from all over the world and peoples from all over the world. And I will say this: we are not better than anybody, but nobody better than us. Simple, straightforward.
Right. Prime Minister, this country of ours, culture, music, dance is important. A matter of fact, we had a soul-lifting rendition tonight by Rodney and his team.
The young man
Right.
is a genius.
You are a powerful student of history. And so you know, for example, that after the Middle Ages came the Renaissance, you know, and that was a cultural expression which gave rebirth to Europe. You know, for example, in the 1920s, we had what is called the Harlem Renaissance, and where Claude McKay and all of these people came, you know, and brought so much
Langston Hughes.
beautiful, yes, so much beautiful music and poetry and so on and so forth, right? And you yourself took our music, meaning James E.P., Capeless Heroes, Rodney Small with Hans John and somebody else, I think, and Darren Andrews, Keep the Faith, and you sent it to the UN. And so, in my mind, in your own practice, you see a great role for culture in the Respair for people. And this must come from your own education, as I said, as a student of history, right? But from your practice as well. Could you, and my reading of your book tells me one thing, and you said it tonight as well. You have a faith in the genius of this people, that we shall prevail regardless, right? Do you want to give a little bit further expression of that, explanation of that? You know, I know it's late, but I think that is important.
Now, first of all, I had said earlier that the Caribbean is a unique civilization of authenticity. And the Caribbean has been shaped through pain and suffering, joys and triumphs. And through the evolution, with peoples coming from different lands and different cultures, and admixing with the indigenous people, in our case, the Kalinago and the Garifuna, that I say all the time metaphorically, we are a symphony. We are the songs of the indigenous people. We are the rhythm of Africa. We are the melody of Europe. We are the chords of Asia. And we are the homegrown lyrics of the Caribbean. Like all symphonies, we have dissonances. And those dissonances are resolved either through formal institutions for the resolution of dissonances, or really through our informal institutions which have come about through our culture, our practices, our way of life. I set that as a broad frame. And in order to accompany the paradigm shift in the economy, you have to have accompanying it a further ennoblement of this civilization. And we have adopted and adapted. We have created things of our own and we have mixed them with others because we have come from disparate lands and peoples, and within our own landscape and seascape, specific things have evolved. The steel band, for instance, has evolved. You can't help be uplifted by this or by calypso and soca, the poetry. I see a lot of young people, including young women now, writing. We had, before, we had our sister who is in Taiwan, Peggy Carr. She was the leading female poet. We have several younger ones coming along. And of course, there are some established other ones, males.
Jimmy Prince used to be one until you capture him for politics.
Yes,
huh?
Jimmy Prince did good work. And their writings of the creative imagination, novels and so on. And I don't know if you notice that the visual arts, painting for instance, There are persons now fashioning their own independent sphere and styles. You see the work of Calvert Jones.
Yes.
You see the work of Shanique Stewart. These are two young artists who, alongside with others who were there before, Dings Johnson and so forth. And they're giving expressions to our personalities, our landscapes. Some of them just straight imaginative work. And telling stories through the prism of our own eyes. And all of these things are uplifting in pretty much the same way that people who are with the Gospels when they preach it, because they preach it with a Caribbean particularity, though they have universal values. I must tell you personally, when I go to a church and I hear a man, instead of he say God, he said, I want to talk to you about God. I immediately, because the word isn't G-A-W-D, they pronounce it like, that's how it's spelled from the deep south of those United States. And they don't always go there, but I must tell you it's off-putting. And I have to, I listen to all these things on there, close my eye and I follow them and so on and so forth. No. All of this make the civilization grow. And it is that part inside of that space, that fluid space where the genius of the people resides. But it doesn't only reside in the arts and in culture, it resides in workmen, and the carpenters and the masons and the use of our own local materials, and with our engineers and the young people who are coming with the modern science and technology and applying them better. And we see a number of these persons doing their tremendous work. This is why we want to help with all of this. We want to have a cultural, educational, sporting production hub at Bellevue. We have a lot of land, the state has a lot of land where the Central Arroot factory used to be. Well, Arroot is no more below the river. So may as well we'll use the space there and build a fantastic facility with a proper theater and recording studio and fitness and IT, cutting edge technology and some applied things, because you're in the rural area for production in respect of agricultural, agro-processing and all the rest of it, and a lot of education and training, and provide the supports that they can do their own businesses. We want to do something too in Petit Bodel. And when we move the port, when we finish this port, we'd have a lot of land, and we want to have a similar thing in that part of Kingston, because we have to have it where we have the space and so on. And sometimes people say, why don't do that? You have to sequence things. You sequence things, and you can't do everything in the city. For those people who say, well, the modern medical should not be in Georgetown because of Suffolk. Well, the logic of that, we should only build trash house up there and wait until every 50 or 100 years for Suffolk. Or that we should just live everywhere else and have up there as a burial ground. You know, I do understand. I mean, so all of these things are vital for us in the process of developing, and Respairing. But these things require a lot of resources, so I have to go and look for the money. We're starting some of those things this year in doing the preparatory work. But anytime I leave, when I'm going somewhere, I hear, you hear it on the radio, we going there for? Some people, how much that trip there cost? They know the price of everything and the value of nothing. Well, the point is this. Let me tell you straight and plain. And I don't want anybody to think I'm arrogant in this respect. No ignorant radio announcer or any such critic of narrow politics is going to dissuade a man like me for doing what I have to do in order to uplift St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Now, I've said this recently several times, and I want to restate it. If you want a leader to be encased in a village mentality, that you want me to go in Connery and hang out by Big Lion Shop or go up in Goss and think the leaders of the world when they come meet me. I am not Joe Biden. It's not that Joe Biden is a better conversationalist than me, or could tell stories better than me, or could recite poetry better than me. Though he and I share an interest in Irish poetry. He's of Irish heritage, and you know, we have quoted it to each other and so on already. People are lining up to see Joe Biden because Joe Biden is the President of the United States of America. That's a fact of life. The size of the economy, the importance in the world. Who lining up come see the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and Grenadines? Me have to go they go see them. Eh? I mean, let's be honest and straightforward about these things. And we have been able to secure lots of resources by going out. The president of the Caribbean Development Bank yesterday had a news conference. He said the gross financing needs, which is a new category, GFN, the gross financing needs of the member states of the Caribbean Development Bank, the borrowing member states, because of COVID, 10 billion US dollars. And that the need would increase up to 2030. I believe that 10 billion is an underestimated number.
Yeah.
And he also says, the economies of the region cannot provide that. Therefore, that funding has to come from outside. Because you don't make a cannery by Big Lion and get the money there. I mean, that pure dotishness, and anybody who talk like that until think an intelligent man like me, you could repeat it as much as you want, and you could get a whole set of ignorant people follow you with that. Well, that doesn't have any impact on me. Okay. Sensible and ignorant people have a vote, and because I do that, you can go vote against me in the next election. That's your right. But I'm telling you, I have confidence that you have more sensible people than stupid people in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. More progressive people than backward people, and they understand what I'm talking about.
Okay. Prime Minister, we have to bring this to a close. I mean, I came here with 35 questions for the Prime Minister. I think you can count how many I've asked, because I went through this book thoroughly. I have read practically everything that the Prime Minister has offered to the public. And he's a profound intellect. Please, yes. It seems that people don't want to go home.
I want to suggest one thing that we wouldn't have the time tonight, but when persons read the book, I want them to look. I spent a lot of time, Richard, and you spoke about it to me earlier today, and I read it in your review, your written review. And Hilary Beckles, Professor Beckles, when we did a similar conversation in New York at the time of the General Assembly of the United Nations in September, that I've also documented the work not just of the central government, but of dozens of organizations which we have created, state
Yes.
entities, and the way we have reinvigorated existing organizations.
Chapters 4 and 5.
And we have some of the leaders here. We have National Lottery, Maury Bullock. We have Garth Saunders, the immediate past Chief Executive Officer of the Central Water and Sewage Authority. And these institutions, I don't know if Tonley Myers is here, he has a Vinlec and so on. These institutions are critical in the entire process of repairing, not only the central government. And I think that is a matter which is of great importance. I want to say this. I told Angie, who is Permanent Secretary in the Office of the Prime Minister, that I think that in this period also of repairing, I don't know how many persons we have here. Angie, how many books we brought? About 140, 150? I know persons thought we were going to sell books, but I'm going to give them. And if we have more than that 100 and number, we will have to get others to give persons where they can collect from you and so on and so forth. Because we will, I know my brother Games, I know you took some and you're selling at your bookstore. You'll still sell them because there'll be great interest and people will say, I get one. They say, well, where I could get this? They say, no more, Games have some selling. So you know what I mean? But you'll get a free book for the pain of sitting down for 2.5 hours listening to me and Richard.
Okay. Prime Minister, I want to just read what you say are the outcomes of repairing. Then I'll give you a final word. And before our MC comes back, I want to do something special. So I just want to read this and ask you what you really think. Can we achieve this? This is what you say on page 249. The outcomes of the process of repairing and recovery must be seen practically to include new or additional jobs, inclusive of quality jobs, enhanced opportunities, improved living standards, poverty reduction, the ending of undernourishment and hunger, citizen security, improved delivery of public goods, and quality time for leisure from necessary and desirable work. Now, this is a tall order, and this is a tall order in a very small country, third world country, a poor country. Do you believe this genuinely, and if so, on what basis? Well, and before you answer, and then you could give your final word, and then give it back to me because there's something special.
No, repairing must have outcomes. It's not something in the sky, which you just talk about there. It must have practical outcomes. With jobs and quality jobs, improve citizen security, and so on. And quality leisure. Because human beings must have good leisure time. And we have been making progress on many of them. But as I say, we have to take care of people, deal with all the historical problems, the inheritances, while shifting the paradigm for the nature of the amended colonial economy, which has been in existence for 200 and something years. That's not easy to do. But we have to do it. And you know what's happening? Sabi and I went this out of us. Sabi is going around the country with an agricultural program. Among other things, he has specifically, in addition to several things in his ministry, he has $27 million he has to spend very shortly. His mandate is to spend that money and spend it properly. I'm not talking about inside the administrative things and so on. I'm talking about these things that to go to farmers, a small portion to fishermen, because there's a large pot for fishermen too. Pot for fishermen pot. When we went to south of us. Overwhelmingly, the farmers spoke principally to two central issues: improving the feeder roads, which they're quite right about, but by far the most significant issue they dealt with is predial larceny, stealing of their crops and their animals. And they had some experiences relaying about how some policemen, who by name and by salary, but who are civil servants, sedentary civil servants by practice. That's what, Richard, that's what they're telling you. That's not me talking. Yes. So immediately as I came down, I had to report this conversation to the Commissioner of Police. And the Commissioner, I think, is here. Yes. And he had some officers with him. No, he had a main officer in him because they were making some criticism about the police station in Connery and the one in Georgetown. And the officer who was in charge of that area was in. So he asked if he could put me on the speakerphone. I said, yes, I want him here, what the people say. Now, in dealing with predial larceny, as outlined to them, not only do we have to strengthen the things with police and so on and more patrols in the area, but I had challenged the people to. I said, but inside of this group, you all know who are the thief man them. And you must cooperate so that we get the thief man them. It comes back to the same issue I'm talking about with solidarity and being with one another. Because if we don't have that, our difficulties are going to be more than they should be. Our challenge is more awesome than they ought to be. And there is nothing, I must tell you, like as refreshing as always being in contact with the rural folk, the farmers or the working people. Not people who go from their office to the radio or from their home to the radio and don't keep in contact with people and imagine what people are concerned about. And once you're in communion with the people and you try to get them to be in communion with each other, we can be greater, we can have a greater success. What we cannot do, and Respair is a word in the English, a old word in the English language. I give an old one now too. We can't have what could be called, and I'll spell the word, Panopticon, panopticon. It's an old word too. You don't find it all about. The origin of it was the philosopher Jeremy Bentham in the early 18th century in designing a place as a prison, that you have a central tower where the guards can see the prisoners. The prisoners can't even see each other when the prisoners can't see the guard. You can't have developmental panopticanism. You had to be able, everybody had to see everybody eye to eye and talk and be in solidarity and resolve these problems. Respairing.
Okay, thank you very much. As I've said, I came here thoroughly prepared to discuss this with the Prime Minister, but it's late. and so you want to get home. However, what I want to do now, I consider necessary. Dr. Gonsalves is a thorough intellect, but more than anything else, he's a patriot, a genuine human being, a man who loves people. I've seen that myself. And this country has been restructured, redesigned, if you want, by him over the last 22 years. He has an idea of this country, an idea for this country. And I say this, I am not a politician, I'm not a member of his party, but I think I'm not totally stupid, you know? And so I have looked carefully, and as he knows, we say in Latin, as lawyers, the facts speak for themselves. And there's so much one can say. But you know, the education revolution as we know it now, we see the buildings, we see the children, and so on and so on. Ralph has done a little bit more. He's contributed to it by actually producing materials for it. So I asked you all to please stand with me and show our genuine appreciation for this great man, please. Ladies and gentlemen, our Prime Minister, Dr. the Honorable Ralph Gonsalves.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I didn't expect this prompting by Richard. Thank you.
Over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Byron Cox, Prime Minister Gonsalves. Thank you very much for giving us the insight into the origin or the idea or the vision and the policies of the government and the philosophy behind the policies of your administration. There are a lot of things that came out of the conversation and discussion tonight. Very rich content, very rich discussion. I believe those home, abroad, of course, those of you in the audience here, no doubt see the depth and the breadth of the Prime Minister's mind into the policies of his administration. Everything is in sync. Behind every policy, there's a purpose or vision down the road. And as the Prime Minister said, there's a sequence to everything. Very important. With that, Prime Minister, as I said, this book, The Time of Respair, will serve as a document for historians, political scientists, students who wish to delve into our own Caribbean civilization. The Prime Minister mentioned on chapters 4 and 5, there are a lot of information about our statutory entities, including the expansion of our financial institutions, which I also was great. It was pleasing to look at and showing the growth of our institutions since 2001. But we are coming closer to the end of the program, and I will now call on our cultural ambassador, Mr. Darren Andrews, to provide us with a special rendition. And please, with a round of applause, welcome Mr. Darren Andrews. Thank you very much, Darren. Well, as I mentioned earlier, at my right, which will be your left to the extreme back, the author or Prime Minister will be doing the book signing. A few of them, given in the interest of time, a few of them. But as I mentioned, having read the book, as myself, I consider myself a student of politics, a student of history. I'm a great lover of history. Once you have a deep interest in understanding, one, I know the Prime Minister likes to say how the thing run, and also in understanding where we were in terms of our development and where we are going on, where we should head. Trust me, this book is for you. I guarantee it, I recommend it highly that you get this book. It is one that will open your mind. It will even make you question some of your own beliefs, whether economic or otherwise. It will help you to understand things that you didn't before. Makes you see things in a different perspective and a different light pertaining to economic and overall development. Therefore, coming to the end of the program, I want to thank everyone, those of you who joined us, who stayed up. It's now 12 minutes after the hour of 10 o'clock. Those of you in the diaspora, those of you who are viewing online via VC3, YouTube, and other mediums, those of you also tuned into your radio stations, those of you who, of course, here in the audience with us, far, really and truly, we appreciate you coming from the Office of the Prime Minister. Thank you very much, Angie, also, and those who participated in making all this possible. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, coming to the end of the program, again, we appreciate it. Prime Minister Gonsalves, Dr. Cox, thank you very much for that wonderful conversation, rich in content and discussion, and surely we can understand why the Prime Minister, I remember recently in Barbados, you are considered as a father of our civilization by Senior Minister of Bajan Government, Mr. Simmons, I believe, who said that. So therefore, it shows you how esteemed our Prime Minister is. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I will invite the author to go to the back and start with the signing of the various books. And while the books are being signed, I will call our cultural ambassador, Mr. Rodney Small, and Ambassador Andrews to provide us with entertainment. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Do have a blessed and wonderful night.
you.